I used to work at a place called O'Hurley's General Store here in Shepherdston, West Virginia. It was a real old-timey general store, the kind that sells everything from buckets and barrels to books and pocket watches, in addition to the regular selection of groceries and liquor. It was an all-right job for a young man such as myself, patronized by generally polite and well-meaning folk. Sure, I had a fair few drunks get a little rowdy when I wouldn't sell them hard liquor on a Sunday, but nobody ever put a gun in my face. But that ain't to say that I didn't have one or two incidents in there that put the fear of God into me, and this here is one of them. So I'm working late one Saturday night, stacking shelves and cleaning house, when a man walks in wearing a black tailored suit. It was one of those that fit him like a glove and gave off an obvious air of wealth, which marked him as an out-of-towner in my book. But that suit was just about the only normal thing about him. He was white as the cotton fields, so pale he was almost gaunt, with razor-sharp facial features and slick-back silver hair. I hear the little bell on the front entrance tinkle, so I do my thing and walk back behind the counter to serve him, which is where I laid eyes on him. He walks up to me, and with this wolfish smile on his lips, asks me for a can of lighter fluid. I fetch him what he asked for, making a little small talk as I ringing him up on the register. I asked him where he's from. D.C., he replies, just passing through. I gave him a polite smile and asked him if he was one of those politician types, to which he gives the vague reply of something like that. He then proceeds to take out the biggest roll of dollar bills I'd ever seen in my life, all hundreds from what I could tell, then places one down on the counter in front of me. I give the man his change, remarking that it's a good thing it had been a busy previous few hours, or he'd have wiped me out for change. I said it in this fairly jokey tone, expecting him to at least give a polite chuckle in return, but he doesn't so much as smirk. He just takes out the Zippo lighter from his suit pocket, just about the shiniest I'd ever seen, and proceeds to fill it up with the lighter fluid right there in front of me. I've seen a fair few of those lighters in my time, but never one that I could have sworn was plated with silver. I figured he must have been hankering for a smoke, something fierce, and I told him as such, but he replied that he didn't smoke. Right as he says that, he finishes up filling up his lighter, but not before accidentally spilling a little of the lighter fluid onto his finger. Then just before he pieces the shiny-looking Zippo back together, he brings the finger to his mouth and sucks the drop of flammable liquid from his finger like it was a drop of homemade wine or something. Now, naturally, I quietly recoil when he does that, not quite being able to believe what I just witnessed. He sees me do so and shoots me another one of those wolfish grins like he enjoyed the idea of freaking me out like that. I was just on the verge of asking him what that was all about when I hear the doorbell of the general store tinkle again. I look over towards the front entrance, and in walks this young lady who looks to be about the same age as my little sister. Couldn't have been no older than about 14 years old. Only she's dressed much younger, almost like how you'd expect a toddler to dress, in this denim skirt type thing with white embroidered flowers on it. She addresses him as Daddy, so I figured it was his daughter, and tells him she needs to use the bathroom. The man in the suit then turns to me, asks if there's a bathroom that his daughter can use, so I give him the key to one that we had inside the store. Only instead of just handing it to his kid, he takes out a little leather wallet-looking thing from his jacket and hands that, the lighter, then the key to the little lady, who then makes her way off towards the door before locking it behind her. I started to feel incredibly uncomfortable. Something about the whole situation just didn't sit right with me at all. I had a sneaking suspicion of what was contained inside the small leather wallet thing, but I didn't feel like I was in any position to confront the suited man on it, especially not based solely on a hunch. But it wasn't just that. The kid looked absolutely nothing like him. She had these soft, rounded, delicate features along with real curly hair, while the suited man's face was so sharp he looked like he could have cut a swath through a pumpkin patch. And the way she called him Daddy, a girl that age should be well on to calling her father Dad, Pop, or anything but Daddy. I tried to distract from my discomfort by asking him where he and his daughter were headed. You ask a lot of questions, don't you, young man? He replied, dropping what had once been a kind of formal civility entirely, and proceeded to stare a hole through me. His eyes, man. He had these narrow brown eyes so dark that were almost black, and I felt a shudder run through me as he fixed his gaze to mine. Just making conversation, I remember saying back to him, shifting nervously behind the counter. Well, you know how the old saying goes, don't you? His voice was smooth, just creepily calm, like there was no emotion behind it whatsoever. Curiosity killed the cat. The suited man turned, then started walking up and down the aisles, eyeing up the products like we were some quaint backwater relic, which I suppose was exactly what we were. I get back to cleaning house for a minute or two, only it's more just going through the motions while I keep an eye on what this guy's doing. I figured it'd only be a minute or two before his kid emerges from the bathroom and they fix to get back on the road. But 5 minutes goes by, then 10, and still no sign of her. Just as I'm about to ask him if he thinks she's okay in there, the bathroom door unlocks with a loud snap and the door opens up. There's no flush, nothing to indicate she'd actually been using the bathroom for its intended purpose, and when she emerges, she seems all sleepy and dozy looking. Then she hands back the keys, the lighter, and the black leather wallet to the suited man in a daze before giving him a lazy-sounding, "Thank you, Daddy." The way she said it right then, I knew he wasn't her father, and it was dripping with sleaze, and the look he gave her in return was one a father should never, ever give his daughter under any circumstances. It made me sick to my stomach, and I wanted the pair of them out of my store immediately. But we rarely just come out and say something like that where I'm from. We'll say something with an implication, if you catch my drift. "Safe travels now," I remember saying to the suited man. My tone was friendly, but the look I gave him was not. He turns and looks at me like he was about to go through me for shortcut, like he could have eaten me without salt there and then. Then he walks up to the counter, places the bathroom key down on top of it, and says one final thing to me. "Remember, young man, curiosity killed the cat." And then he walks that little lady out of the store, and then drove off into the night. I seriously considered calling the sheriff right after they left. But what was I going to tell him? That a man was traveling with a girl that appeared to be his daughter? I'd be laughed right off the line. I could have mentioned that I thought that there was something illegal in the leather wallet that he'd handed her, but I got the distinct impression that nothing we could ever accuse him of was really going to stick. He had all that money, and that look he gave me too. So I didn't say a word to anyone. But for the remaining few hours of my shift, and for the next few days, I heard his words rattling around my skull whenever I paid any mind to him at all. Curiosity killed the cat. On the night of March 15th, 1989, Tracy Lynn Kirkpatrick was working at Aileen Ladies Sportswear in Frederick, Maryland. Tracy was an introverted young woman, often opting to communicate her thoughts and feelings through handwritten poetry than actual verbal conversation. She was also something of a bookworm and excelled in her academic life. She was also extremely hardworking, holding positions at 2 retail jobs in order to save money to pursue for a law degree at an Ivy League university. One of these jobs was at the previously mentioned sportswear store, where on the night in question, she was working the closing shift. At around 6 p.m. on March the 15th, Tracy's mother arrived at the store to bring her daughter some dinner. She was a supportive, loving parent who often brought Tracy a plate of home-cooked food, which Tracy would then share with her colleagues on duty. She later said that nothing appeared amiss at the store and that her daughter seemed to be in a perfectly jovial mood. 2 hours later, Tracy's manager finished her shift and departed the store, as it was routine that lower employees would cash up and lock down the store at the usual closing time of 9 p.m. No sales were recorded after that point, So if there had indeed been any visitors, they certainly hadn't bought anything from any of the clerks. After closing, one of the unit's security guards happened to notice that some of the store's lights were still on, long after they should have been turned off. So at around 10:30 p.m., he entered the store to investigate the situation, concerned there may have been an intruder who was using the lights to steal merchandise, having broken in using a back door. He took out his key to unlock the front entrance of the store, only to find that it was still unlocked. Deeply concerned, he thoroughly searched the front and back areas of the premises, only to make a terrifying discovery. In one of the back storage rooms lay Tracy Lynn Kirkpatrick. There was a puddle of blood beneath her unconscious body, along with stab wounds to her chest and back. The security guard then rushed to call emergency services, hoping she could still be saved, but on arrival, paramedics found that she could not be revived, and they announced her dead on the scene. Police then arrived to cordon off the area so that a forensic examination could be undertaken. Horrifyingly enough, Tracy's parents were also on their way to the store, concerned that their daughter was having car trouble and might need a ride back home. But when they arrived on the scene, they saw the blue flashing lights of police cars and feared for the worst. We cannot imagine how painful it was to have their worst nightmares confirmed that their only daughter had been murdered by some mysterious assailant. All throughout the investigation that followed, Frederick homicide detectives failed to identify any singular motive for her slaying. The cash in the store's registers was still present. Tracy had not been indecently assaulted, nor did she appear to have any obvious enemies who might wish to see her come to harm. There was no evidence of any chase or struggle, which suggested that Tracy knew her murderer as they approached to fatally wound her. Yet not a single person working at the store that day had seen anything suspicious, or could suggest anyone they thought to be guilty of such a horrific crime. Investigators were completely and utterly flummoxed. That was until 3 months later when a person called into the U.S. National Confessions Hotline. A recording of the call was made, which reads as follows. "Hello, my name is Don and I'm calling from Frederick, Maryland. I know this is going to sound surprising, but 3 months ago, I stabbed a girl to death, and you might think that in making this tape, I'm setting myself up to be caught. But there are a lot of guys named Don in Frederick. The girl I killed was working in a ladies' sportswear store. I often came by and talked to her when she was working alone. And one night when she was in the storeroom and we were talking, our conversation turned into an argument. And so I took out a knife I had with me at all times and I killed her. And a few days later, I realized I had created a lot of sadness, and I thought about turning myself into the police. But whatever they do to me, they won't bring Tracy back. So I've decided that I better keep free because we have the death penalty in Maryland. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry about what I did, but nothing can change it. Bye." Staff from the confession hotline forwarded a copy of the recording to Frederick police, and the call was traced to a place called Walkersville, a small town in the same county that was just less than 10 miles away from the Aileen Ladies Sportswear. 2 weeks after the call, a self-proclaimed psychic telephoned Frederick police, informing them that their investigations should center around a man she only referred to as Sean. She claimed the Sean character was acting strangely regarding the case, going as far as sending her clippings from newspapers and asking her bizarre and probing questions about Tracy Lynn Kirkpatrick. Apparently willing to follow up any lead they had, no matter how ridiculous sounding, Frederick police then descended into Walkersville, where they played the audio recording of the confession to various members of the public in the hopes that they might be able to identify the voice on the tape. As it turned out, several people recognized the voice on the tape as neither a Sean nor a Don, saying it belonged to someone whose identity was never made public by investigators. This man was never arrested or formally charged with Tracy Lynn Kirkpatrick's murder, and despite thorough searches of his property and his complete lack of alibi, he was subsequently rolled out as a suspect. Essentially, the identity of Tracy Lynn Kirkpatrick's killer is a complete mystery. But there is one interesting detail that seems to have been completely overlooked by law enforcement. You see, there was a man named Don present at the sportswear store that night. The same security guard that apparently stumbled across Tracy's body is named Don Barnes Jr., and his father is none other than Don Barnes Sr., who was actually the sheriff of Frederick County at the time of Kirkpatrick's murder. Yet despite him being one of the only people present at the time she was murdered, Don Barnes Jr. has never been considered a suspect. Now this could easily be because whoever committed the murder was well aware of Don's presence in the area on the night of the murder and sought to implicate him. But even if this was the case, surely Don would have faced some form of casual questioning, given that no one else was present when Tracy Lynn Kirkpatrick's body was found. Yet apparently he didn't, and many have alleged that this is because Don Barnes Jr. was actually a prime suspect whose involvement was completely covered up at the hand of his sheriff father. However, the allegations of nepotism are exactly that, purely allegations, and since no single person has been charged or implicated in the crime in any serious way, the case remains, and may forever remain, unsolved. "26-year-old Deborah Deanne Poe grew up in Northern Virginia near Washington, D.C., eventually moving to Orlando, Florida in late October of 1989. Whilst in Orlando, Deborah rented a duplex with a female roommate, fostering dreams of purchasing her own home with the profits she hoped to make from her fledgling catering company. In order to realize said dreams, Deborah worked 2 jobs in the Orlando area, one being in the sales department of the Orlando Sentinel newspaper, and the other working 5 nights a week as a clerk at the Circle K convenience store on the intersection of Hall Road and Aloma Avenue, where she was entirely alone whilst on the job. Scott Iyagi, another clerk at the Circle K who also happened to be Deborah's boyfriend, handed over his shift to her at around 11 p.m. on February the 3rd, 1990. 2 hours later, Scott returned to the Circle K to see how Deborah was holding up. She was relatively new to the company and was blessed that her boyfriend was willing to put time aside to assist her in her nightly duties. Once Scott was sure that she would be okay, he drove home to get some rest, expecting a call from Deborah once she had finished her shift at around 7 a.m. Yet he never received one. Shortly after 3 a.m. on the morning of February 4th, a friend of Deborah's happened to be driving by the Circle K store. She attests that she saw Deborah behind the counter, clearly recognizing her distinct hairstyle from some distance away. However, around a half hour later, a customer parked up in her vehicle in the Circle K's parking lot and walked inside the store to buy a pack of cigarettes. This particular customer was a regular visitor at the time of the night, given that she too worked the late shift at her job, so even though Deborah had only worked there a short time, she had become accustomed to seeing the sleepy-eyed young clerk behind the counter. But to her surprise, when she walked in that night, it wasn't Deborah on duty. In fact, the man who stood behind the counter didn't appear to be an employee of Circle K at all, given that instead of the usual uniform, he was wearing a black Megadeth t-shirt emblazoned with a fire-breathing dragon. The customer inquired if he was a new employee, to which the strange man replied in the affirmative. She then asked where Deborah was and was confused when the strange man didn't seem to know who she was. After all, the Circle K team were a close-knit bunch that included a romantic couple. But if this young man was indeed a new employee, it was perfectly understandable that he might not be entirely familiar with his colleagues yet, so his answer didn't arouse too much suspicion. The customer shrugged it off, then asked the clerk for a pack of their favorite cigarette brand. Yet not only did the strange man not seem to be familiar with where the cigarettes were located or which brand was which, he seemed to have a great deal of trouble operating the register too. Yet, as with her previous inquiry, the customer simply put it down to the teething pains of a new hire, and calmly waited for her change as the strange man pushed one button after another before the cash register finally popped open. As she left the store, she heard the strange man lean over the counter and say, "You really shouldn't smoke, you know," in a tone that left her feeling distinctly creeped out. Then, Just another half hour later, another customer walked into the Circle K only to find it completely deserted. They called out for service, but no one came to their assistance. Something didn't sit right with them at all, so they made the decision to call the local sheriff's department to warn them that something bad may have happened. Police arrived a short while later to discover that Deborah's red Toyota was still in the parking lot, all locked up. Yet strangely, they found not only were her purse and paycheck still in the car, but also that her actual car keys were locked inside too. On inspecting the interior of the Circle K store, the cops then found what they assumed was Deborah's Circle K uniform, folded and neatly placed behind the counter. The register was secured. There was no obvious sign of theft of either cash or product. Neither was remotely out of the place. It was as if that night, Deborah had simply vanished into thin air. A canine unit was called in, and the dog handler gave his canine a whiff of Deborah's uniform, instructing it to follow the scent. The search dog then rushed around to the rear of the store building, alerting on 2 distinct spots on a section of pavement. The first was a patch of concrete behind a derelict business just next to the Circle K. The other seemed to be through a gap in a large wooden fence that led into the parking lot of a neighboring apartment complex. After that, the search dog seemed to lose her trail. The sudden loss of the scent trail led investigating sheriff's deputies to conclude that Deborah had either willingly entered a vehicle which promptly drove off, or had done so under duress. But since Deborah hadn't returned to either her job, her boyfriend, or her rented apartment, the only real question was who might want to abduct the hard-working and personable young woman. What quickly became obvious to investigators was that the solitary nature of Deborah's work made her a very easy and obvious target for kidnapping. She was an attractive young woman, working alone in a gas station in the middle of the night, at a time when there was no CCTV cameras present to record the interior or exterior of the business. According to her boyfriend, there was also no shortage of bothersome customers to include on the list of suspects, some of whom harmlessly flirted with Deborah. Others, she complained, had made some legitimately predatory remarks to her when they came in drunk in the wee small hours. Her boyfriend told the police of one particular incident that Deborah complained of, which occurred just a fortnight prior to her apparent abduction. According to her, a semi-naked man ran into the Circle K and hopped over the counter, where he then attempted to indecently assault her. Deborah was then pursued around the store for a few minutes, then chased outside to the gas pumps, where she was able to evade the man and make it back to the store before him, where she promptly locked the doors to keep him out. It was only when Deborah had secured a full-time sales position at the Orlando Sentinel that her family and boyfriend pleaded with her to quit working at the Circle K, citing the dangers of working alone in the middle of the night. However, Deborah refused, arguing that she needed the extra hours in order to raise funds to put towards starting up that dream catering business of hers. As a kind of compromise, Scott began to accompany her to work, remaining in his car while she worked and drinking coffee to stay awake so that he could keep an eye on her. But this only irritated Deborah, who complained that she didn't need to be chaperoned, especially when her boyfriend should be at home getting the sleep he needed to complete his own full-time hours. After collecting statements from various eyewitnesses, police decided that their investigation should focus around the creepy-sounding Megadeth fan who was standing behind the counter when the smoker arrived to buy cigarettes. The Orlando Sentinel ran a missing persons ad in the classified section every day for 11 years after her abduction, ending in December 2001, but information yielded from the ads proved useless. Yet after more than 30 years, the hundreds of tips from the general public, this man has yet to be identified. There were also some doubts that he was even involved in her disappearance at all, given that he could have walked into the store, possibly drunk, saw that there was no one behind the counter and decided to play at being a clerk for an hour or so. But it would have to be something of an extraordinary coincidence that he had been present in the store just a matter of minutes after she was supposedly abducted. Either way, police were never able to identify or question the man, and so his identity and level of involvement remain a complete mystery. In the immediate aftermath of Deborah's disappearance, police were not in position to go public with all the information they had to handle, since they were worried that it might frighten their suspect into fleeing the area altogether. But after 3 months of no luck in their investigation, Orange County Sheriff's Department held a press conference in which they revealed a composite sketch of the so-called Megadeth Man. He was believed to be aged between 19 and 25, with long, wiry, dark hair and brown eyes. Aside from the Megadeth t-shirt he was wearing on the night in question, a witness had described him as wearing a skull ring on his left hand, along with a crucifix piercing dangling from his right ear. But perhaps most importantly, a black van has been parked outside at the time of his appearance, one with a large, colorful Megadeth mural airbrushed onto the side. It was believed that this detail would make him easy to identify, since such a vehicle was likely to be very memorable and somewhat unique. Then in August of 1990, a man riding an ATV made a grisly discovery near to Aloma Avenue, a road that was only 2 miles away from where Deborah was last seen alive. It was a decomposing human corpse, mostly skeletal, and due to the geographical and physical similarities, it was believed to be Deborah's. However, much to the relief of her family and friends, the jewelry on the corpse was found to bear no similarities to that which they knew that Deborah owned, and after a comparison that was made between the corpse's bite pattern and Deborah's dental records, the possibility of it being the missing clerk was ruled out. It gave her family hope that she might still be alive. Over a year after the corpse's discovery, in November of 1991, Deborah's case was featured on the popular TV show Unsolved Mysteries. Over 150 viewers from all over the country called in with fresh information, most of which involved the identity or location of the Megadeth Man seen behind the counter that night. Orange County Police also received a call from law enforcement officials up in Virginia, who told them they were investigating a remarkably similar case and actually had a suspect in their custody who matched the physical description of the Megadeth Man. However, despite the physical similarities, detectives were unable to charge the man up in Virginia and were forced to investigate other suspects during the following few years, one of which was an ex-boyfriend of Deborah's who she had broken up with, citing mental instability. Another came to the attention of detectives as of late 1998, following reports that he would talk constantly about Deborah's disappearance with an apparently unhealthy interest. But once he was confronted by police, the man simply lawyered up and refused to talk about it anymore, subsequently dodging a charge for her abduction. Almost 12 years later, in March of 2002, a large team of Orange County Sheriff's deputies and volunteer search and rescue personnel assembled in an empty lot behind the Chapel Hill Baptist Church on Trevarthen Road in Orlando. They spent around 14 hours intensively searching the 1-acre lot, which was only around 3.5 miles from the Circle K gas station, having identified it as a possible location for Deborah's remains. Their reasoning was that it was in close proximity to the home of a new suspect in the case, but refused to say just who that was in reference to. That day, 5 of the 6 search canines present alerted to there having been human remains in an overgrown section of the field. Yet the 12 hours of excavation that followed yielded nothing of significance, although that didn't rule out that Deborah's body had been buried there following her murder, and then moved at some point during the early stages of the investigation into her disappearance. However, terrifyingly enough, local newspapers discovered that this location was close to the apartment of none other than Deborah's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance, Scott Yagi. The very same man who had been so insistent that the blame lay with one of the men harassing her was now prime suspect in what was, by that point, assumed to be her murder. Yet he too was never officially charged with any crime. It has been more than 30 years since Deborah Deanne Poe disappeared from her job at the Circle K gas station in Orlando, Florida. 30 leads of dead ends, bad leads, and failed charges. There have been no human remains discovered that had ever been successfully identified as belonging to her. No one has ever come forward claiming to be her, and no one has ever confessed to her murder. For intents and purposes, Deborah simply vanished into thin air that night, never to be seen again. Even as the world ventured into the era of camera phones, internet media, and communities of people obsessed with unsolved mysteries, there have been no significant developments in her case. 30 years later, the question remains, just what exactly did happen to Deborah Deanne Poe. I used to work in the bars and pubs here in Liverpool, something I would not recommend to anyone. But it paid the bills and I got to work with friends, so I stuck at it for a few years, eventually landing a supervisor's job. Now, one of my duties was to make sure the tills were in order, making sure they had enough change, that the notes weren't all stacked messily, that sort of thing. Only the tills we had were absolutely terrible, so this one Saturday night, I popped the till open and the whole drawer just comes off its hinges, subsequently refusing to slot back in. I'm stood there just rolling my eyes and calling this thing every name under the sun before I turned to one of the bar staff and asked them to go get the general manager for me. They do, and I'm left standing there like a human till drawer, because I can't just leave a load of cash sitting on the back bar with a load of drunk people hanging around. So like I said, I'm stood there just sort of looking around to make sure no one is eyeing me up to jump over the bar and grab a fistful of 20s. Just up from where I'm standing, there's a little flight of stairs going up to a round bar where we'd serve cocktails and whatnot. Only it's not all that busy, so the bar isn't manned. Point being, I can't see exactly what's going on up there, so when this bloke walks past the round bar, lifts one of the little red leather stools above his head, and throws it down to the floor, I don't see exactly what happened, only that something really dodgy is going on. Now, I probably should have just stayed with the money, but if this fellow is in the furniture-throwing mood and has already done some damage, I need to know just what he's done, then tell the door staff so they can get this bell end out of the bar. So I put the till down on the floor, tell the one remaining member of bar staff with me to guard it with their life, then jog up to the round bar to look over to see what had just happened. What I see makes my jaw drop. Sitting on the red leather benches there, out of sight of where I'd been standing with the till drawer in my hand, are two girls. One is absolutely wailing. I'd have heard her if it wasn't for the loud music in the bar, and the other is trying to comfort her. Then I notice that the wailing girl's mouth is absolutely pouring with blood, and I put two and two together. The fellow had grabbed one of the stools, raised it up to his head, and smashed this girl in the mouth with it. I immediately jump up over the bar, rush over to the girl, and kneel down to see just how bad the damage is. I'm not messing. It looked like she opened up a bottle of tomato juice, emptied it into her gob, and then just let it dribble out of her mouth. There was just a hideous amount of blood and tissue streaming out of this girl's face. Then right as I'm about in front of her, she looks at me through these tearful eyes and spits out a load of her own teeth onto the floor in front of me. I've never seen anything like it in my life. Like I'd seen a fair few bar fights while working there, but absolutely nothing like the kind of injuries she sustained. So I just bowled into action, legging it after the fellow that had hit her in the face. I run into the front area of the bar, recognize this fellow's orange shirt, then just leap to grab hold of him so we can keep him in place for the police to come nick him. But I'm sort of in shock while I'm doing this. Like I literally cannot believe he's just done that to a girl, and for apparently no reason. So I'm just like, You just hit that girl. Why'd you do that? What are you thinking, man? And he's looking back at me, just not reacting to what I'm saying at all. Turned out he was French, and he didn't understand what I was saying, especially since if he did speak any English, he definitely didn't understand my Scouse accent. And I'm still staring him in the face when he just sort of looks over my shoulder in the sort of way people do that makes your brain go like, you should really look behind you right about now. So I turn and see the bloody-mouthed girl walking towards us with an upturned and empty bottle of Beck's in her hand. At first I think she's going to smack this fellow with it, which he definitely deserved, but I'm not going to pass my probationary period as bar supervisor if I just let people just kick the life out of each other, am I? So I step forward and put both hands up like, don't do it, love, expecting her to try to move around me so she can bottle the bloke. Only she doesn't try to move around me. She looks me dead in the eye, blood still pouring from between her lips. She's not crying anymore either. She just looks furious, I mean, the look in her eye was absolutely terrifying. She looked nothing short of psychopathic. She then raises the bottle above her head and charges me. I immediately, whoa, it wasn't me. But it's no good. In her mind, she's made up, and she brings that bottle down at me with all the force she can muster, swinging it vertically, directly at the right side of my face and neck. It was the kind of swing that could have had the bottle smashing in my face, broken glass raking down my eyeball and cheek before slicing right into my carotid artery. That's the Kill Bill cut, the kind that has blood squirting out of your neck with every beat of your heart. If she hit me there, that would have been it. I'd be dead on the floor of my own workplace in a matter of minutes. But you know how people say that time slows down when you're in that sort of situation? That's not entirely wrong, only it's not time slowing down, so much as your brain speeding up as a result of the adrenaline poured into your bloodstream. So, as I watched the girl start to bring the bottle down, somehow I found it in me to bring the outside edge of my right hand up to meet it. I didn't feel the glass of the bottle break in my hand. The whole thing just sort of disappeared from view, but at the same time, I just sort of knew some serious damage had been done. I remember gripping my wrist, cursing out loud and retreating back to the bar to assess the severity of the cut as the girl disappeared into the busy crowds that occupied the bar. I dreaded turning my head over to inspect the damage in that terribly human way that says, if I can't see it, it didn't happen, but I knew I had to. And it was only when blood began to pour onto the floor in front of me that I brought myself to look. Thank God I didn't before that, because the broken bottle had cut so deep that I've been able to see deep into the muscle of my hand, and that's definitely something I didn't want to have to look at. While another member of staff rushed to fetch security from the front doors, I wrapped my bloody hand in paper towels and held onto them to stem the bleeding. That really should have been the end of the situation. I should have just waited for an ambulance to arrive, but the girl that could have killed me was probably still in the bar, and as much as she too needed medical attention, I couldn't just let her get away with such a vicious and violent assault. So I asked my 2 members of the security team to accompany through the throngs of people in an attempt to find her, and also the guy that had hit her in the face with that little stool thing. It was only when I was wading through the crowds of dancing drunks that I realized just how stupid of me it was to be doing such a thing. There came a moment when I realized that in the low lights of the club rooms, with revelers who all basically looked the same after a while, that she could have been anywhere. It was like that scene in the second Jurassic Park movie with the long grass and the raptors. The crowds were the long grass, and she was a raptor. She could sneak up on me through a crowd like a freaking Assassin's Creed game, and I'd be absolutely none the wiser until she was right up on me. And the next time, I might not have been lucky enough to be able to defend myself so readily. The next bottle could have cut into my throat or face, and I'd have life-changing injuries, maybe even life-ending injuries. It was an absolutely terrifying realization, and the more it dawned on me, the harder it got to breathe. I found myself hyperventilating by the time I powered it back towards the bar into relative safety, telling the security staff to just look for the girl with a bloody mouth. It was about then that I saw blue flashing lights through the large glass windows of the club's street entrance. Another member of the bar team gathered up my belongings from the staff room, then accompanied me to the ambulance, which then drove me to the hospital after doing some preliminary bandaging of the wounds. Then came the long wait in the accident and emergency waiting room at like 3 on a Sunday morning. Wait times at British NHS hospitals can be bad enough at the best of times, but at a time like that, they can be almost unbearable, and not because of the boredom, because my time there was anything but. The place was abuzz with people with some fairly horrific but non-life-threatening wounds. Drunks groaned, cradling their shattered hands or sporting pretty grievous-looking head wounds. A pair of women, one of which looked so beaten up she could barely stay conscious, talked openly about being ladies of the night, so to speak. I just tried to keep my head down and avoid making eye contact with anyone. But once I was finally seen by doctors and nurses, they were as good as gold. I mean, the doctor who saw me had to actually cut off a section of flesh from my hand, which I could still sort of feel despite the injection of local anesthetic, which was extremely blood-grim. But they were amazing nonetheless. After the stitches, met with some police officers who had been waiting outside of A&E for me to emerge. I thought it might have been good news, that they managed to arrest both offenders and were looking to take a witness statement from me. But neither person had been caught. That apparently both managed to slip out of the bar undetected. But the cops had managed to question some friends of theirs, and as it turned out, they were a couple. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was a classic case of someone trying to get involved in a domestic argument. The couple just turned on the person trying to intervene. So despite there being very little in the way of conclusion to the story, in the way that a lot of stuff like this has no closure to it, there is one definitive lesson to glean from it. Never get involved in a domestic. Just keep your distance, call the police, and let them handle it. Because I'm telling you from experience, injecting yourself into a situation like that might not just end in a little loss of your faith in humanity. It could just as easily end with you losing your life. 41-year-old Leah Rollins was working the early shift at the Cozad Amoco gas station on Highway 80 in Dawson County, Nebraska, on the morning of March 10, 1997. She was a divorcee who was in the process of getting her life back together after an exceedingly messy divorce from her husband, with whom she'd raised 2 sons. And given that she had been promoted to manager only a day before, it appeared as if though she was achieving exactly that. Friends described her as being generous, personable, and a generally good-natured person. Her husband had treated her abominably in the aftermath of the separation in light of the fact that she had retained custody of the 2 boys. For the first time in years, things seemed to be going right for her, and she relished the fresh responsibilities of her new management position. But at around 10:30 a.m., a red Pontiac Grand Am pulled into the gas station forecourt. CCTV cameras recorded the driver stepping out of the vehicle and filling up on a tank of gas before entering the main store. The man seemed of average appearance, except for one seemingly minor detail. He was barefoot. As he entered, Leah was busy serving a mother and daughter pair, making small talk with the girls as she tendered their money and handed them their change. The barefoot man stood to the rear of the store, making himself inconspicuous as he seemed to wait for the mother and daughter to depart the business and drive away. He took a soda out of one of the fridges, cracked open the can, and began to drink it as he waited, at one point staring right up into the lens of one of the interior security cameras as he did so. Once the mother and daughter had driven away, the barefoot man calmly walked up to the counter where Leah was stood, took out a 9mm pistol, and pointed it at her. Security footage was unable to catch exactly what he said, but judging from Leah's subsequent actions, it appears he had told her to open the cash register and hand over its contents. Once the barefoot man had taken the cash from her, it appears he ordered Leah to lie down on the ground behind the counter. She complied with his command while he proceeded to count the cash she had just handed him. Then out of nowhere, for no apparent reason, the barefoot man leans over the counter and fires 3 shots into Leah as she lay prone on the floor of the gas station. 3 shots that would kill her instantly. The barefoot man then simply walked back to his red Pontiac Grand Am and drove back off down the highway. Leah's friends and relatives were absolutely devastated upon hearing news of her death, but they were hopeful that justice would be swift since the police had a rather large amount of evidence to work from in order to identify and locate her killer. As he was mentioned previously, the barefoot man had actually stared up into the lens of one of the gas station's security cameras, so police had a pretty clear image of who they were looking for. A Caucasian male in his late 30s or early 40s with dark hair and eyes. His vehicle was quickly identified as a red Pontiac Grand Am, but given that it was lacking a front license plate and drove off at high speeds, it was impossible to make out any plate number. The bullets fired at the scene were identified as 9mm and fired from a small handgun, but unfortunately the ballistics weren't identified as matching that of any from other crime scenes that the police were aware of. The barefoot man also left a series of full fingerprint sets from the gas pump all the way to the counter, but again, they were found not to match any in police databases anywhere in the state of Nebraska. However, there was a detail regarding the shots that led police to believe that this was more than just a robbery turned violent. One of the shots fired struck Leah in the back of the head, and the CCTV footage showed the barefoot man apparently taking aim with his final shot, suggesting he had deliberately executed her and simply used the robbery as a cover for his true intentions: cold-blooded murder. Despite appealing for witnesses and tips from the general public, police received very little in the way of information, and that proved useless in identifying or locating the barefoot man. The CCTV footage from the gas station was even shown on the popular TV show America's Most Wanted, but even then, it proved impossible to identify their suspect. The simplest explanation for the crime was that it was nothing more than a violent robbery, as random as it was tragic, most probably perpetrated by someone who was simply passing through the area and needed some money. CCTV footage certainly supports the idea that it was a career criminal who committed the murder, given how confident and systematic his actions seemed to be. They were doubtless that this wasn't the first time he'd taken part in a violent robbery, nor would it be the last. This was on top of the fact that the case was remarkably similar to a handful of other apparently random murders where the victims were gas station workers, which proved just as difficult to solve. As police puzzled over the case, uncertain over the particulars of the murder, one person seemed certain that they knew who was responsible. Leah's brother, Roy Rollins, seemed to have absolutely no doubt that her ex-husband was somehow to blame for her death, suggesting that the motive was the messy divorce they had both suffered through during the previous few years. Her ex-husband, a man by the name of Barry Rocap Sr., owned and operated a successful restaurant on the U.S. Virgin Islands. He was a very wealthy man, and when Leah had left him, she had taken with her a sizable amount of money and secured a large alimony payment, given that she had custody of their 2 sons. Roy Rollins also revealed to the police that his sister had also written their sons, who were young at the time of the divorce and confused over the reasons, a 16-page letter which explained her motives for leaving her father in the sudden and dramatic way that she did. The letter details years of torment and abuse that she suffered at his hands, and how she grew to be horribly afraid of his temper and violent nature. Upon seeing the CCTV footage on his sister's edition of America's Most Wanted, Roy became transfixed with the whole barefoot detail and insisted that this man was evidently some kind of hitman who was native to the tropical Virgin Islands and therefore comfortable with walking around in his bare feet. This hitman, according to Roy Rollins, had been hired by Barry Rocap Sr. to murder his ex-wife in revenge for taking so much of his money, and so that custody of their 2 sons could be returned to him. Barry Rocap Sr. died in early 2015 and was never officially implicated in commissioning her murder, but he was also never officially ruled out either. However, the barefoot gunman was never found, and no clues to his identity were ever gleaned as a result of police investigations. His fingerprints, the ballistics information, and the CCTV remain on file, and the case is one that remains unsolved in the state of Nebraska, with no new information coming to light in the subsequent 23 years since Leah's murder, and thus, her murder firmly remains a mystery, one that's left purely to public speculation of unsolved mystery sleuths across the world. This is until one day, God willing, more evidence comes to light and the barefoot killer is finally brought to justice. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord, interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, in space, no one can hear you cream.